Hello, everybody. This is the first virtual Bible study session, also known as the Unordinary Bible Study, which is a that partnership project that I'm doing with my involvement in the Active Inference Institute. So this is, of course, going to be an unordinary approach to what most people typically expect from Bible study sessions. And the main motivation is to get more into deep philosophical territory and getting deeper into how we relate to what faith means to us and what that means with our place in the universe and all that good stuff. So, getting deep into philosophy, mathematics, physics, talking about even technology. Um, so, and the real unordinary part is instead of going through the individual books of the Bible, we're going to basically go from different contemporary perspectives and relate it back, cross-referencing, talking about modern contemporary perspectives and different ideas revolving around um, talking about what's the role of our humanity in the universe, and talking about meaning of life and all that kind of stuff, and what God means. So especially today, I definitely want to at least I propose my point of view that aligns active inference um, through the lens of process theory to not to generalize what God is, but taking certain aspects of what we can pick out, at least from the Christian principles perspective of the Abrahamic faiths, that at least points out to what are certain aspects that are relational man to God, so to speak. And So, okay, so what do I mean by active inference? So active inference has much to do with thinking about the impact of our short and long-term decision-making dynamics with respect to how we perceive the world around us. So engaging with stimulus, and then of course action, dealing with how we respond to stimulus, and then the history of this perception and action dynamic in terms of how we develop a model of the world around us, and with that would penalize our fitness in some, or uh, reward our fitness in some sense, or maybe there's some in between outcome between penalty and reward with respect to what active inference implies. So thinking about also, given that we are these in the scientific sense, we are these multicellular organisms, uh, and we have the sense of awareness on top of being multicellular organisms, right? And this sense of awareness gives us this capacity to um, align our agency. So, like, this capacity gives us this sense of agency, and hence, in cognitive science community, there's this term agents or agential systems, and agents have degrees of agency to engage and respond to uh, the world around them and engage with other agents. So getting to what God means, then we can take, if we look at what the Abrahamic faiths, um, like how they relate to each other, because most people that affiliate with with some religious faith tend to be there's a lot of people in the Western world, especially that identify as Christian, and there are many different denominations of Christianity. There's also many people that identify with Judaism or Islam, and these are all representative of the Abrahamic faiths. And it seems what's interesting about faith is this idea of developing ethical policies, like this idea of moral compass alignment, if you will, like how we perceive each other and appreciate, uh, how we appreciate and evaluate our model of the world around us and each other's agency as well as our own, and how that impacts our decision making. So now, going full circle, we are concerned with the optimizing our capacity to be accountable for our sufficient level degrees of agency and how we can engage and impact the world around us, even as groups of agents at scale, like groups of individual humans, how we individually impact the world around us, how we in groups, so cultures, thinking anthropomorphically. So this really deeply ties into even thinking about not just from the anthropomorphic perspective, thinking in terms of anthropology and culture dynamics, but also thinking about we can get into the anthropic, relating this to the anthropic principle in physics, or especially even the holographic principle. So there's a lot of potential directions we can go in terms of relating what God means, and what that has to do with humanity, and how we as humans collectively engage other for better or worse in our environment. And I think the most optimal set, from my point of view, from the most optimal way of appreciating each other, acknowledging each other's agency, as well as how that impacts our ecosystem, the optimal outcome in regards to optimizing our interactions. To me, that is like the dynamics of the sacred, or I guess what you could call different aspects of what God means. So this idea of compassion, um, acting in good conscience and in good faith of others, of how you carry yourself with respect to others and your surroundings. So to me, that's what God means. So I figured I think that would be interesting to provide that perspective, and how we can take active inference and apply it to faith, or what faith might mean to each of us, and hopefully that relates well to people either participating or watching this recording. But now, in terms of, okay, well, what does this have to do with Christianity? I guess I went on quite a bit of a tangent. So just to tie it in, I came up with this cognitive model of the Holy Trinity. So this dynamic of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost. So relating perception and action and prior dynamics of how we engage the world around us. The Father represents the history of optimizing outcomes for better or worse in terms of how we collectively as humans engage with each other in the world around us. And the Son represents setting the best example that appreciates our agency and the world around us, while the Holy Ghost represents acting in the moment in good conscience. Like, how do we best conduct ourselves in alignment with the Son and the Father? So that in a nutshell is the cognitive model of the Holy Trinity, and I could expand more upon each of the different aspects of the cognitive model, but I figured I'd throw that out there. But before we get into biblical verses, I guess if other people want to provide commentary on the perspective I provide on relating active inference to God and relating that uh, relating that to Christianity, I'm interested in what people have to say about that.
What is your scriptural basis for this relationship?
There's a lot of interesting takes in scripture um, that denote acting in good conscience or love and compassion. Like that, there's a lot of passages that make reference to this or mention this directly in scripture. So I was being more general when I mentioned that, but I figured before I pick anything out specifically, because I went on quite a bit of a tangent and mentioned a lot, um, because I definitely have quite a bit bookmarked. So I'll get into some verses that we can get into, but I figured I get some comments on what I propose, and then we can move on from there.
Well, just to somewhat answer the question, two of them come to mind. You have Proverbs that talks about being a good friend. We see some examples in Job as well. And you also have Matthews and Mark, where Jesus talks about loving your neighbor as you love yourself. That is one of the rules that we have, and it's one of the main things that is asked of us as followers of Christ, to be able to see ourselves within our friends, even within our enemies, and pray for them so that they have a fruitful life, and if they may want the worst for us.
You told me that you said kids are number one, right?
Yeah, I actually did a lookup. We can actually get into this one. I generally use the NIV version. I have an app that I use, but right now I'm on Bible Gateway. Uh, it's going to show it to me directly. Sure. Let's see. Yeah, Proverbs 27. I think it was verse. Verse 17. No, it wasn't. It wasn't verse 17. I'm sorry about that. Let someone else. Okay, Proverbs 17, starting from verse 2. Let someone else praise you and not your own mouth, an outsider and not your own lips. Stone is heavy and sand a burden, but a fool's provocation is heavier. A fool's provocation is heavier than both. Anger is cruel, fury overwhelming, but who can stand before jealousy? Better is open rebuke than hidden love. Wounds from a friend can be trusted, but an enemy multiplies kisses. That's pretty interesting.
Is the other Jesse still here, Jesse?
Was there a particular verse in Proverbs that you had him?
For me, I didn't have any particular a particular verse in mind. I just know that some books do in fact talk about being a good person and being a good friend. And Proverbs is one of them, as well as Matthews and Mark that I know of. And also there's the story of David and Jonathan. Am I correct? Are you familiar with that story?
I am not familiar with
where
that particular story?
the king wanted to kill David, but um, the king's son was David's best friend, or they were best friends, and he helped hide David away so that his father wouldn't kill him. So different acts of kindness, different acts of brotherhood and friendship are mentioned within those passages.
Okay.
That's what they need to do. My shit.
Yeah, Acts 24:16. It says, "I always strive to keep my conscience clear before God and man." So to me, like having a clear conscience has a lot to do with how I like to think about how we have a balance in our life of what we prioritize. And then the sense of mindfulness is not easy to get into, and I've learned a lot recently that there's a lot of dynamics that go into humility in terms to like being honest with ourselves in terms of like what are our strengths and our limitations in terms of how we can conduct ourselves and help others. So I think that to me that's probably the greatest challenge is lessons in humility and how that enables us to do more or less for our communities and how we have an impact on our environment. But I don't know how often you guys think about dealing with like life lessons or like lessons in humility and thinking about, okay, like where do I go from here?
Every day. What were you gonna say?
I was gonna say I think about that a lot, but it's very hard to strike a balance between because we can almost become too humble and lose a certain natural confidence that we have, and that
Yeah.
confidence and humility they come together when we are living with the Holy Spirit and walking and feeling the Holy Spirit.
Mm.
It's like a tough love kind of thing, but we don't get kicked when we're down, really.
Mm.
That's my relationship with the Lord.
Why is it that we don't get kicked when we were down?
I think that if you turn to the Lord in a place of humility, um, and you're already feeling beaten up and torn up, He will uplift you. And He sort of, for me at least, waits until I'm at a place where I can handle His sort of harsh truths for me. Sometimes I'm not ready for them, and He lets me know there is a truth that you're not ready for yet, but we will get there at some point. And then other times I am in a mood where I need to be taken down a peg.
Yeah.
And I'm sort of brought down, reminded that I'm a man, reminded that I'm just a mortal, that life is fleeting and all my skills are fleeting. No.
No, that's a very good point. I think for us to have a successful relationship with God, it requires that we first notice and accept our dependence on God. And I think that's one of the reasons why it says in the Bible, it will be very hard for a rich man to enter heaven. Because once you reach a certain status, once you have a certain level of income and you're able to buy whatever it is that you require, need, or want, you seem to think that you can do it all by yourself. I don't know if you ever heard quotes from billionaires and they say, "How close are you to God?" And they'll say, I never thought I would get this close, but I feel that I can, pull strings and
Mhm.
make things happen that I know the average person is unable to do. And so with having a faith in God requires that that regardless of how smart you may be, regardless of how wealthy you may be, or whatever the case is, you still depend on this person lift you up, to give you purpose. Because in a blink of an eye, you can get into an accident and you're no longer able to function. In a blink of an eye, you can lose your most treasured possessions. In a blink of an eye, anything can happen. And so it requires that you know within yourself that all of the things that you are accomplishing, even if it's something that you did based on your merit, uh, the hand of God, the invisible hand of God, always played a role in that also taking place. And though the second point that you mentioned in terms of even when you're down, you still have somebody to go back to. And I think that's a very good point because um, even though it's sad that we tend to go to God when we are at our lowest, the fact that He allows us to do that and He still uplifts us says a lot about who He is as a person and a character and what He would like from us in terms of how we treat our brothers and sisters.
I feel that's an inspiring story for all of us to do, meaning when we encounter another person who is at their lowest, we need to be compassionate. And too many environments will kind of dogpile onto the people when if they express vulnerability, like a pecking party with chickens, And I think that's not a good way to behave. That creates toxicity, that creates a sense of vulnerability among everyone that just kind of can paralyze people. So the idea of reaching out to people at their most vulnerable is an interesting one.
It is love in its truest form. And I say that because I think when a person is going through their best days, they don't necessarily need help from anyone. They don't seek anybody's attention or something, but it is when they're going through their lowest. And one of the best definitions of love I've found is me knowing what can hurt you and still choosing not to use that against you. And another way of looking at it is if I know that you're down right now, this is not the perfect time for me to tell you, I told you so. You shouldn't have done this. It is the time for me to say, okay, as you're going through this process and you are sobbing, it's my time to tell you that it will be okay and that you will recover. Because life itself is its own cycle. You will have days where you are man, but you will have days where you are, sulking. And if you have somebody around who understands that and wants to be kind to you during those days, that can be quite uplifting, and it can help you and carry you through the days to come.
Yeah, to see if anything came in the
Yeah,
mail
what's
yet.
going on?
Waiting for that
There's
ID
this
to come
very
through.
a lot of people when they think about a lot of the parables of Jesus, a lot of people think about the moments where he's walking on water. And at Bible study, my local Bible study yesterday, there's a local church I go to in my area, so it's like walking distance, which is very very convenient for me. But we were talking about in Matthew 14 verses 22 to 36. This is the NIV version. Immediately, Jesus made the disciples get into the boat and go on ahead of him to the other side while he dismissed the crowd. After he had dismissed them, he went up on a mountainside by himself to pray. Later that night, he was there alone, and the boat was already a considerable distance from land, buffeted by the waves because the wind was against it. Shortly after dawn, Jesus went out to them, walking on the lake. When the disciples saw him walking on the lake, they were terrified. "It's a ghost," they said, and cried out in fear. But Jesus immediately said to them, "Take courage, it is I. Don't be afraid." "Lord, if it is you," Peter replied, tell me to come to you on the water." "Come," he said. Then Peter got down out of the boat, walked on the water, and came toward Jesus. But when he saw the wind, he was afraid, and beginning to sink, cried out, Lord, save me. Immediately, Jesus reached out his hand and caught him. You of little faith, he said, why did you doubt? And when they climbed into the boat, the wind died down. Then those who were in the boat worshipped him, saying, Truly, you are the Son of God. When they had crossed over, they landed at Gennesaret. And when the men of that place recognized Jesus, they sent word to all the surrounding country. People brought all their sick to him and begged him to let the sick just touch the edge of his cloak, and all who touched it were healed. So we had this interesting discussion about thinking about what if you were Peter and you thought about the decision to reach your hand out to Jesus and walk on the water, right? Like imagine yourself in that situation of wrestling with faith and like being how we relate that to the challenges of life. And so there's this deepness about like how we have these moments where we wrestle um, psychologically, we wrestle with ourselves and what we ought to do based on our circumstances. And I think this is inspiring in terms of like, what challenges our faith, and to not doubt to not doubt ourselves in those moments that, when we're challenged, that we keep going strong, and try and make the right decisions.
There are a lot of key points within that story. I think one of the first one is faith, knowing that you have somebody who you can always rely on. And I like the fact that the word immediately is used once Peter himself is sinking. Immediately he reached out his hand to help him. But also within that same sinking conversation, I think sometimes some individuals, anyway, they wish to have a relationship with God, not to truly serve, but to be served. You see how um, they were saying, or Peter was saying, "Can you please, if it's really you, make this happen for me. Make me walk on water as well." And people tend to say that humans are selfish in nature, which may be the case. And I think that's where a lot of the arrogance and pride also comes. And if we were to take the other approach of serving, then we would be in a better predicament than we are today on Earth.
I think the real difficulty too is like how we interpret scripture, and not only that, like just you know the models that we envelop of reality, like even for people that let's say that aren't Christian, like just like the way that we align our intentions, that like it's easier said than done when we talk about being mindful, because I think there's sort of a duality of like you know having it keeping the ego in check in a way, because like having too much pride works against us, but also having enough pride and recognizing and how with confidence we um put, I guess acknowledge our own role and try to fulfill that. And I think for me, God's not just about, it's not just personal, it's interpersonal, right? I think the interpersonal aspect is probably most critical, but like the personal it, you know, has to do with how we have a balance in our own lives, but the interpersonal is how we align that balance with acknowledging that there are others there, and that we should be mindful about how we interact with others, and how we, you know, utilize our resources in our ecosystem. And hopefully for better, because I think the whole point about faith is that it is for better. It is that we are trying to maximize for the most optimal outcome. That, you know, unfortunately, some of us might have a selfish interest. You know, some people like are, you know, might have some very egocentric, selfish interest, and that's unfortunate. But you know, maybe they might realize that, oh, it's not just about me. And to me, that's really important. And why I say why I've decided to have so much value in the lessons of life and humility, because it's like, you know, we're all human, we're all mortal, we're all limited in our understanding of the world around us. I mean, there's only so much that we can understand about reality. So I think one of the challenges too is like, as humanity, as society, develop more understanding of the world around us, developing more formalisms about of knowledge and what have you. What what enables something to become knowledge, you know, and how we can use knowledge to hopefully develop technologies that don't exploit humanity and our ecosystem, but complement that the symbiosis. I think like the real attraction, the allure to me of the potential of faith, and how we, uh, you know, how humanity, uh, I guess, largely redeems itself in the face of God, right? Like there's ultimately the Abrahamic faiths denote this quest of personal and interpersonal redemption, because humans have just such a bad history of primitive violence, and you know, causing more problems rather than uh, providing a means that where as more humans enter the world over time, we scale for better of how we engage with the world and have less of a detrimental impact on our surrounding environment, and coexisting with other organisms that aren't human. So I, you know, anyway, not to go on a tangent. I don't know if anybody had anything to
No,
add to
no.
that.
You were mentioning something in terms of humility,
Yeah.
and I remember reading this a while ago, and I'm sorry, and I went back to it. It's in Matthew 26, verse 39. I have the CEV version, so I can go to the NIV version currently. But so it's really Jesus. He knows his mission, right? He knows that he's supposed to come to earth to die so that us, the people, might be saved. And at this little moment, he is um, excluding himself from the community, and he goes to pray where he asks, "My Father, if it is possible, don't make me suffer by drinking from this cup, but do what you want and not what I want." So it's him realizing that in a few days or in a few weeks, whatever it may be, I have to go on this cross and I have to die for these individuals. And I don't necessarily want to do that, but I also have in mind that this is part of the plan so that they can be saved. Earlier, you mentioned how you described the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, and in talking about the Son, you mentioned that this is the example for us to follow. And you have to see how kind he ends up being, giving himself. Where people say, if I were to give my life for a brother of mine, that's one of the best acts I could ever do as a person. And he right there does exactly that, where here I am. I know I don't want to die. I know I don't want to suffer, but if I don't suffer and I don't die, then I don't get to save all of these people. And I know in philosophy, we have different conversations. I know we talk about the trolley example, where you see one person, let's say they are your sons or daughters or daughter, and you see a train over here, and if you pull the lever, you get to kill only your son, but you save 1,000 or 500 people on the train. But if you don't, your kid gets to live, but these individuals on the train dies, and he still chooses to kill himself just to give us the chance to also follow his word. And I think that's humility at its um highest.
Yeah. I think there's some interesting, unfortunate dilemmas in terms of like, the trolley problem is an example. It's like, what's worth more, one life or all these other lives? And it's okay when then you start adding context. Like this person can get a Nobel Prize and that can save and cure cancer. This one person you save as opposed to these 500 people, right? So you start adding context to the trolley problem. You're like, oh man, it's not that simple. It's like choosing the one person or the 500 people or however many people, right? Because adding context changes how you evaluate the circumstance, right? And then that changes the dynamics of how we I guess that changes the dynamics of how we evaluate like what's morally right or wrong to consider how we come to a decision for a situation like this, right? But
Yeah.
yeah,
And
I
that's
don't.
one of the things about the trolley problem. I've been presented with it in a lot of different ways, and I don't think there's ever been a time where I think it makes sense to kill 500 people rather than one. You know,
Mm.
even if that person
It just ends up being
had the
a
cure.
highly speculative scenario, right? And it's like, well, it sounds quite irrational, right? Because where are the odds? Like 1 in 500 people, but then you see like how many opportunities you get thinkers like Einstein, right? Every century.
Mhm.
Um, and like how I mean, yeah, moral dilemmas are quite crazy, and like thinking of like prisoner's dilemma examples too. Um, but
Because
yeah.
even if it were Einstein as opposed to 500 prisoners, right, who've committed crimes, by killing them in a sense, you do take away their chance at redemption
Yeah.
of them being able to change their lives. And so, if you really think about all of it, and you get to think about the families or mourning or the fact that society diminishes because now you have a cessation of so many different uh, um what's it called, families or um generations, a lot happens within that. So, and if we really do think about it and refer it back to biblical terms, if Jesus decided that his life mattered more than ours, where would we be?
So I guess like for me, what matters most is not whether or not that all of the parables and analogies drawn from the Bible actually happen. I think there's a lot of symbolic and meaningfully interpretive uh, ways we can take each parable, even let's say none of the apostles or Jesus as people existed. It's not whether or not they existed that matters. It's the psychological archetypes that they manifest as in principle that matters. Like what we get out of the narrative is what matters. And I think, you know, the debate around whether or not archaeologically we can show, okay, all these characters in the Bible actually existed, that doesn't matter as much to me as what we get out of the archetypes that we can abstract out of scripture and and what that means in terms of how humans relate to each other in the world around them, because it's really a story about how humanity can guide itself. And I think that even in the worst case of how humanity can guide itself, where you have incoherence in how people relate to each other, you have the fall of Babylon, right? Like that, like, you know, like that to me, like that's a beautiful analogy to like what's the worst that can happen to humanity, even if Babylon didn't actually happen. It's still such a very capturing narrative. Um, but I'm not sure if you think how much time you spend thinking about the archetypes, and I think that's where Jordan Peterson gained a lot of popularity. Popularity was breaking down the different archetypes we can derive from the biblical narrative, rather than talking about whether or not anything that happened in the Bible actually happened in real life. But what we can really say is there's a lot of relationality in terms of how we relate to each of the characters. And there was a lot of people that had those names back then too. So there was a lot of people with the name Jesus. There was a lot of people with all these names like John, Paul, Matthew, James. Like these were names of people back during the time the Bible was being written, and even before it was written. So, um, but I'm sure that's something interesting that a lot of skeptics and agnostics spend a lot of time thinking about. But I'm not sure how often you think about those points, or if those points are meaningful to you.
I know I've seen certain names quite often. I've even seen Judas's name, and it referred to two different Judases. Um, I think the same with Peter, if I'm not mistaken. Uh, but I thought there was, at the time anyway, one Jesus that existed at this time. Where have they found evidence of other Jesuses within that period? I know currently we do have some, but at that time,
Mm-hmm.
I thought there was only one. That's my perspective anyway. I've not looked into that. I'm just asking.
Well, what I was saying was there was a lot of that was like a common name back then. I think like there are a lot of names used in scripture were common names people had. Whether or not the actual depicted
Mhm.
characters existed, that's another story. But the naming, like the names of the characters, many of them were common. Uh, but I mean, that's also an interesting take too. You know, like like where they're actual near accurate manifestations of these characters. Not to say that the stories were literally exact, but the way that they played out was quite um predictable to the story, like as it unfolded in the biblical narrative sense. but I mean, even then, I think like it's interesting that like we could just have so much relatable experiences that then like sort of in their own way relate to how the different parables in the Bible unravel. Like I think that in itself is interesting. Like even thinking about how many ways we can interpret um the resurrection and being born again. Like there's so many ways to pick that apart. Um, and I mean, we could also start talking about that as well. What does it mean to like for me? What it means to be born again? Oh, somebody is waiting. I'm gonna admit them. All right, hello.
What's up, Jesse? How are you?
I'm doing all right. Thanks for joining us. We just started talking about what does it mean to be born again? What does the story? How does the resurrection relate to each of us in terms of the journey we are taking in our lives or how we live our lives I think that also ties into mankind redeeming itself, this quest for redemption, how like there's so much history behind humanity doing wrong and how we collectively and individually relate to making up for those wrongdoings or our own wrongdoings. um but before that, we had a lot of discussion talking about um I introduced when I introduced the content of our study session. A lot of what we're focused on is contemporary perspective exploration and relating back to different verses in the Bible. We went over a couple verses in Matthew. So I think what really what one verse I really like that Kasny uh just talked about was Matthew 27:39 through 44. Um but anyway, so in terms of like how being born again and what does it mean uh to each of us individually. For me, it's like starting a new chapter in my life and like trying to make up for certain like shortcomings that can really hold me back
Okay.
personally and interpersonally. uh and like really making a change in my life uh that capitalizes on what I can do for myself and for others. And
I don't think that you really can make up for the wrong things that you've done. All you could really do is repent and accept Jesus into your life. I mean, we can't erase history. We can't change anything. Our actions don't matter in the end. I mean, we could try to do the best that we can, but someone who is not able to help as much as like a billionaire is not going to be differentiated from them in the end, as long as they have pure souls and honest intentions. I've tried to start new chapters almost weekly at this point. I just, every week, I feel like I wish I could just reincarnate and start a fresh life, but I find myself wrapped up in history every single time.
So to answer the question
Yeah.
in terms of reincarnation in the sense, in terms of transforming yourself or being born again, I think one of the best examples that we have is Paul becoming Peter. So you have somebody who persecutes
Saul becoming
Christians.
Paul.
Say again?
Correction. Saul becoming Paul.
Saul
Yes,
becoming
yes.
Paul.
Yes. I'm so sorry. Yes,
Yeah.
that is
Mhm.
Saul becoming Paul. Thank you for
Yeah.
that. And you
Okay.
have somebody who was feared as a person who attacks or attacked Christians, and he had a change of heart, and he later became this individual who now not only decided to become a better human, but also now guided others to this path, this narrow path of being a righteous individual. For us, I think it'll always be difficult, especially if we try to rely on our own strength to become somebody who is able to make those changes. Just like you, I think I try my very best every week or every day or so to become a better person. And I think each day I fall short. And the Bible itself says, the right that I want to do, I don't do. The good that I want to do, that's exactly what I don't do. But it's also us having within ourselves the faith to rely on God to say, hey, I know it's going to be hard, but if I give myself to you each and every day, by all means, I will reach this stage where I am a new person, where I convert my heart truly, where I am born again, where even if I can't make up for the sins of my past, at the very least, the chapter ahead of me or the chapters ahead of me, the life ahead of me, I then, from today on, I will be this person who follows Christ to the best of my ability. And I think that's really all that Jesus itself, God itself, himself asks of us, for us to have a change of heart, and for us from that very day forward to do everything within our capabilities, relying on God to follow him as best as possible with the example that is provided within the Bible in terms of Jesus, as you said, the Son.
Now, what if you have a pure heart, but you're overly self-critical? Like you find flaws in just about everything that you do, then you're going to constantly be asking for a new heart and to give yourself to the Lord when the heart that you have is already perfect. You're just scrutinizing yourself maybe too much.
Yeah, well, all right. That part is very interesting. As you can see, if you see, Jesus had 12 disciples for a reason, and sometimes there's a Bible verse in the Bible that said God is a great mystery, and if you try to understand it, like that question that whoever that just made that last statement, if you try to go too much, that's the way the mystery. For instance, John went into some kind of place, and that's how he wrote the Revelation. The mystery of God is so hard to understand. But if you just probably choose one of the disciples, like having doubt, we had doubting Thomas, doubting himself all the time. So the characteristics of these disciples, each disciple had unique characteristics. Peter was a stubborn guy, hard-headed, right? So Jesus didn't take perfect people; he took imperfect people. I believe Matthew, the tax collector, he didn't like his demographics, like where he's from. He was a Jew, and as he's not persecuting, or you could call that persecution, persecuting his own Jew, taxing them so high, and so on. So if you can't probably relate to God, Jesus, like in that context, look at one of the disciples and their characteristics. They have flaws, and Jesus still accepted them. And even when they were following him, still questioning. There was another disciple, I believe that most of these Bible movies and history only focus on Jesus. The Chosen is a free app. You can download that. It gives revelation and it gives history of the TV show. It has six seasons with like 12 different episodes. Each it's about Jesus, but each disciple has his own story as we learn more about Jesus. I remember one of Jesus' disciples had some sort of a handicap problem too, and he went to Jesus and asked Jesus, "How do you think I feel? I have powers to heal the people who believe in you, but yet I'm still like I still have a limb." Jesus said, "Do you know what that means? That means you are accepted in heaven. You are greater. Like a cripple healing cripple to walk and do other things, but he also is crippled. So I mean, yeah, all of us have all of these doubts. Like one of my concern is I got questions to ask God. And and some of the like in the beginning, no, when God said let us make man in our own image, I keep asking who are us? Who were he talking to? And God, like here and there, like every now and then I will get a little bit of answer. God included us in creation. He gave us power. And then when we disobey him, he took some of that power away, but still, you cannot take his word away. He just told you that because of this, you will go through that. He added on to it. He gave Eve the power to make, like, bring human into the world. As a result of your disobedience, you will go through pain.
Now, I think there's 2 points. The first thing that you mentioned is quite interesting, how instead of just looking at Jesus, we should also look into the disciples, because
Disciples now who follow him.
we're more like, I think it's
The disciples.
easier for us to find attributes that we share with the disciples than attributes that we share with Jesus. So one of us, as you said, might be a tax collector and we care about our money, and so we have a relationship with Christ might not be as good. Or we may be one person who was outside of the faith or outside of religion or outside of Christ, who was persecuting others, and now we are trying to transform. Or we could be other individuals as well, and now we're trying to find our way back to become like him. And the closer we get to him, the more we're able to. I think that's a very good point. The second thing that you mentioned in terms of making Christ, making humans in our image, after creation, and you had the angels already existed and so on, I think there was this sort of idea of creating this place where people who are like us, not in our current form, would exist and we would thrive as a society. But the fact that we have free will, we were able to make our own choices. Currently, there's this thing I'm working on, and we sent the abstract, I think, earlier, and it's the new conversation on AI. You see how the conversation started, I think, within the 1800s. Well, and then from then on, so you have people like, I forgot the lady's name, but she wrote the novel Frankenstein, where you have Frankenstein's robot and so on, and it grows from that particular topic to now we have artificial intelligence. And you see a lot of the movies or novels that have been written are always talking about either robots taking over Earth in terms of them rebelling against Christians, not Christians, them rebelling against the humans that created them, or them becoming bigger than the humans who created them. And I think that somewhat aligns with us and Jesus or God. So you have God who created us, and we then try to be better than him. That's why you have the story of Babel, if I'm not mistaken, where we're trying to reach heaven on our own, and that is the dismissed. And you also have other stories that follow that same route, where we are rebelling, whether it is to sin and so on. And now you have us with the great
created AI,
where you have created AI, and now there's so many discussions about how AI is taking over and can then become this very thing that tries to fight us.
Kenzie, do you see how the history repeats itself, but in a different context? A lot of people look at it to be exact, but everything that you need is in the Bible. It's just in a different context.
Very true, very true.
And I didn't see it like that until now. You brought it up. I'm like, yeah. So we are actually.
That reminds me of something.
Somebody got some excitement.
Sorry to interrupt.
Listening.
No, of course.
No.
I see an analogy between like the creation story in the Bible or in any
Yes.
religious text and the process for which an author creates their world. Both are processes. They're not like snap your fingers and then it's there. It's like it goes through a
Please.
process. And in both
Yeah.
cases, it starts out very amorphous, like a very super rough draft. And then as time goes on, it becomes more precise. And with authors, there's this concept called letting the characters write themselves. It's a common thing in fantasy writers. I'm not a fantasy writer myself, but this is interesting because, psychology, I studied psychology or neuroscience technically at Hopkins, and it's almost like creating a whole world in a, alternate realm with its own rules. And you can call that magic, but it's God's own laws of physics. And then it's got characters that can come alive and start writing themselves. So that's interesting. It's interesting to see an actual act of creating world.
Yes. Yes. Exactly. You should write something about that. That actually exactly what me, Kathy, and all of us. You just give it a thesis statement, which can be actually proven. We can't prove the God part, but we can prove this part. And based on that story, we can align it with it and say that's the same thing. Everything in history repeats itself.
That's true.
Everything. And it's right there in the
Nothing is-
Bible.
Now, do you believe that about other works of media as well? Because I feel like some things are more culturally relevant and just some things are more personally meaningful when they speak to me more. Sometimes when I read the Bible, I have a hard time even understanding where everyone's coming from. I know they're trying to speak to me, but it just doesn't click. It's not. But I feel like the Lord speaks in other ways too. Like if you were just to
So,
watch a metronome for 5 hours, that could
yeah,
tell you everything you need.
if I was looking, actually, I'm trying to study myths of the world, legends of the world. The word myth is a little bit disparaging because it's like saying, "Oh, none of that happened."
Yeah.
But so I prefer like the word legend or something, more neutral. And like all over the world, the closest one that I've studied a little bit to where I currently reside is Yosemite creation of the mountains myth. Native Americans, 4 hours in the car from here, and it talks about it's it's an example where you have these characters who get into they're human, they're not infallible or anything, and they get into arguments, but their arguments cause massive changes in the landscape, like such as creating Basket Dome because someone got angry and threw a rock and so on. And this archetype is found all over the world, including in Europe and the Middle East, if you go back in time far enough. And it does echo in the process of creating a world, because in the process of creating a world, it becomes more and more real as time goes on. And Earth is, of course, obviously real. Earth is reality. And that story does echo it, like it's saying that there was a time, once upon a time, the world was more malleable. It could respond to the whims of human emotions or animal emotions, because there's some stories involving animals too, and that nowadays it is more crystallized, it's more set in stone, and that you can't just get angry and create a mountain like that. And a similar thing happens when an author creates their world. When it first gets going, they have to kind of control everything by hand, and it's amorphous, and single thoughts can drastically change the layout, but eventually it becomes so stuck that authors can have trouble changing it, and it can be very hard to, it becomes very artificial if you're writing a novel for the world, or a character in the world is doing something you don't want to do. It's oftentimes good authors know how to go with the flow and, work with what they made. So it's an interesting, I'm kind of trying to study a little bit about myths all over the world.
All right.
It's kind of hard to
Just
find
add,
information on, all the little myths of all the cultures, because there's like thousands of cultures and it's hard to find each one.
Yeah, I know.
add
I'm sorry. What were you gonna say, Isaac?
to answer your question. Just don't read the Bible like it's a book, like it's a story. If you do that, then you really understand. Connect the dots.
Mm-hmm.
Like when you read something, there will be some other passage that support that.
Yeah, but
It looks like it's contradictory.
I can never remember anything from the Bible, no matter how many millions of times I go to church or hear it from other people. I find the best way to learn about God is just communicating with Him directly. And
Okay. Yeah.
I remember
Actually,
the basic principles. I remember Jesus. I have my own opinions on what heaven is like. I have my own opinions on where we were before we were born. I remember parts of Genesis, but in the end, I can't remember these people's names. I don't remember who is who. I've never seen them, so I don't. It's like I'm not even looking at a dot. It's like I'm just hearing people talking about a dot. But it is real to me in a very deep way. It's just that the words are so flat, and I have to look at certain verses verse by verse. And there's very helpful apps that let you click on certain words and see where they pop up so you can get some of the symbolism. And I like the edited Bibles that have the little translation notes explaining why they use certain words and the significance. And I think the commentary is more helpful than the actual Bible half the time.
I think, okay, there's one thing I'll suggest that you do. One thing that I've been doing is before I read a certain book, I'll look to see some history about when it was written, by whom it was written. The NIV currently does that in some of the latest versions that they have, or editions that they have, where they'll have a paragraph or two saying, Paul is writing to the Corinthians church, and he's doing so because they have been doing whatever it is that they've been doing, and it's not good, and it took place at this specific time, and he's writing to let them know not to do this or to do that, and so on. And you can also have references that are on Google or wherever. It's just a matter of having one page or so to give you an understanding of the author as well as the audience and what the message should be, or the purpose of that particular book. Once you do that, another thing I'd suggest as well is, as you are reading, you can make notes to say, okay, chapter 1, they discuss this point, that point, and this point, and you have the one-liner or so that talks about what that particular verse or that particular chapter was about. And from then on, you can start to create the story and saying, oh, well, you can fill in the gap, as Isaac said, where you can say, oh, it started with this, and they went into that particular topic, and now they're here. And from that, gathering all of those information, I think by the end of that book, not only will you understand the whole, but you will also understand why all of these specific things were discussed or mentioned within that particular book. I'm not the type who knows the verses word by word. Probably used to do that when I was younger, but I do understand the book itself. So for example, I read the book of Job, and I can tell you that the book of Job is about friendship more than it is about somebody being tempted, because you can see as he's going through these tribulations, who is by him, who is by his side. Or other books like Lamentations. It's about, as we discussed earlier, when you are down and you are seeking God to help you to come back up. And you saying, what is it that I did so that I could be in this place? But he is reminding you that he's still there with you, and you still know that you have an anchor that you can go to. I think there's a lot of different things that we can grasp from it. And the last thing I'll say is after you read a chapter of Bible book and so on, you can try to find one word that describes what that specific book was about. So it could be, I don't know, Genesis, for example. It could be creation. That could be the word. Exodus. It could be faith. Ruth, Numbers. It could be other things. That's what this book is about. And as you reread the verses, I believe it will start to come together, and you will be able to to grasp the story as a whole.
Let me give you one example. The other guy who speaks about philosophy and the morph thing that you just talked about. Look at it with the AI, right? When human developed AI, they technically giving AI free will. Speaking of free will, somebody else mentioned free will. And what did God give us to free will? It's the same likeness of God that we all have. We are made in His image. AI is made in our image, so we give AI free will. That's why we think that it's smarter than us. You see how it repeats? And this is where you can connect. You be like, oh, okay, now I see. That's the mystery of God.
What you're saying reminds me of arrogance. So people often people often don't know, like, can confuse other things for arrogance or arrogance for other things. An example is someone who has ideas and is enthusiastic about them. That's generally not arrogance. That's a sense of purpose, in a sense, and that's healthy. Arrogance is exclusionary at its core. It's saying that, I'm the only one that matters, and what you're saying doesn't matter, and so on. And at Hopkins, it's an elite school and it's got a lot of bright people, but of course it's got some arrogance. It's known for having egos. There's actually quite a few people who are, this is very common to find people who are arrogant but not enthusiastic about their ideas. Because I call it silent ego. Like you get the vibe that they just have this sense of superiority, and then they're not like at all interested in sharing their ideas. That's just a common pattern. And I see that a lot, and it shows that someone who is, enthusiastic, that needs to be supported. People should have a purpose and have a passion. But when it gets exclusionary, when they're not giving other people a chance to express their passion as well, that's when it gets toxic. And a lot of this session has been about reducing the toxicity of environments, following these principles so that you have an environment that is friendlier, that fosters growth and so on. That doesn't have the vices, you could say.
My experience has been the smartest people have always been the least arrogant. And I say this based on personal experience as well as other things that I have witnessed or read about and so on. I remember how I was as somebody who was first teaching in college. And I remember being very strict because I wanted the students to understand that this is a graduate level course and they should have certain standards, right? And it didn't mean that I was a great professor or anything of the sort. I just had my own standards. But then I've also been in rooms with professors who've been teaching for the past 3 decades or so, and they have some sort of a leniency about them or a manner in which they present information that makes it super clear for another person to grasp. And I think that's always been, that's a goal that I have now, whereby I don't only focus on trying to prove that I know or so, but in terms of giving everybody else, like you said, a chance to also present their own ideas. And I think when somebody is, what's the word? When somebody is not conscious, but when somebody doubts their own abilities, I think they try to find a way to make themselves seem superior than others so that it is not noticed. And so people will use different words or use different affiliations to make it seem as though they're the expert within that field, or they're the expert within that in that room. But I think a person who really does know or believes within themselves, they don't try to exclude others, because they do know that they get some inspiration from others, from other thought, and so on.
Oh,
Yeah, that makes sense.
nice.
I've read that. Sorry, go on.
No, I'm just complimenting. Nice. I'm learning actually. I just wanted to before you say something. And before I went back to school to get my bachelor's degree, when I told my friend, this might go off topic. I'm going back to school, and he asked me, "Why are you going back to school? Jesus is coming, right?" This was in 2010. So and this thing about Jesus coming back to judge the living and the dead. Where's my train of thought? Where's my train of thought? Come on. I was dating a girl who, one of the questions who came in my head is like, okay, when is Jesus coming? And she said something interesting. She said, until the last person on earth hears about his name, that's when he's gonna come. And that kind of probably makes sense when I read the Bible. How about you will not, you won't say you didn't hear about me. It's like until the last person on this earth, whether it's that child that life is in his mother's womb, will kind of hear it or feel it that Jesus, there's something about Jesus or God, and then Jesus will come. And today, the reason why I'm mentioning this too is something that I picked up with this revelation in creation, God creating us, we now creating AI. And it helps me understand the mystery of God too. So that's what I just wanted to say.
He's
That's my mystery.
passing down his curses to us. We must bear the brunt of
Of course. And yeah, that was the curse. Like the curse that he gave to Adam and Eve.
Yeah.
I'm thinking that the idea that the smart people are less arrogant on average, I think a lot of that's mediated through curiosity, meaning intelligence and curiosity and being bored easily and wanting to explore new things are all tightly related. And curiosity isn't really that compatible, not to say it never happens, but it's not all that compatible with arrogance, because if you're curious, you want to go out in the world and learn things. And you're not going to be like that. There is some arrogance that can be injected, because if the people around the intelligent person say, "Oh, you're the smartest person I've seen out of thousands," and that happens several times, that can inject some arrogance. But such injected arrogance is a lot less toxic than the silent ego arrogance that I've kind of seen, the more common silent ego arrogance, because it's like transitory. It's kind of like, making the floor a bit dirty. You can just clean it out fairly easily. It's not like some fundamental thing wrong with the foundation. One example of arrogance that comes to mind in programming that also is a sign of inexperience is someone said they don't like Python because it's too easy. And if you know anything about programming, you never avoid things because they're too easy. You avoid things because certain things become too difficult with them, or you lose too much control over things. And it's a subtle decision what toolkits you use. But like, it's just clear for someone who has a reasonable amount of experience in programming that you know, that's a bullshit reason. But he was arrogant. He was trying to prove that he's so smart that he can understand C and that Python's beneath him, and it really illustrates both the arrogance and the lack of
The lack of
understanding, quite in one
that's
thing.
very true. I'll give you a few examples. I think I can think of three in my head. One of the first ones I remember in college, I was assigned to write a paper. I think it was a finals paper, but it was for a nonprofit course, if I'm not too sure, but it was something within the social sciences, and we were asked to develop a solution for a problem, a social issue, and I chose homelessness. I remember spending at least a month or so convincing myself, or actually persuading, because I don't think I convinced myself, persuading myself that I could solve homelessness within a month or two, have an idea that would certainly make sure that no one else after this day that I submitted this assignment, that homelessness would no longer be an issue. And I remember realizing later on that was not the case. But later on in graduate school, I started learning how even as I'm approaching a particular problem, I approach it knowing that I'm only seeing a very small part of the entire issue. And so I forgot the person who said it, but he said there's this level where when we first come in contact with an issue, we think we understand all aspects of it. We think we see all vantage points. And so we say, oh, I can fix this quite easily. But then when we grow in maturity or in wisdom, when we now approach a problem, we see it in its magnitude, and we understand that we don't even understand half of it to be able to really have an answer that can solve that problem. But at the very least, we can chip at it one little bit at a time so
I
that
agree, and
yes,
that reminds me of a friend, roommate slash friend who bought Bitcoin before it crashed, and this was in 2017. Now, if he held it, it would actually go back up. Now Bitcoin's interesting because I was exposed to the idea, and I put a fair amount of time trying to understand what blockchain was, 2011. So like if I had said, hey, let me throw down $1,000 and at worst I lose 1,000, but I can afford it in 2011, but regardless, this friend bought in 2017 where it was much better known. And what's it going to say? He said it was, how do I explain it? I said, oh, it's a gamble. It could go up or could go down, and it's fine to buy as long as you understand that, as long as you understand it's a gamble. And then later on, it went down, he got upset, and he said, oh, you're such a smart PhD, you think you're so smart because you're a PhD student and so on. I was actually claiming to not know whether it was going to go up or down. I did not say go down. I said, I don't know. I don't know how these things work generally. And it kind of shows that little, maybe a little initial arrogance bubble gets popped and then so on. And then blaming me for being arrogant when I claimed to not know in either direction. And what you said, chip away at it, makes me think of tempered optimism. So in programming, it often feels like the sky is the limit because you can automate things. And if you ever played the game Factorio, you can really scale up to, extravagant scales because you automate the process of automating and so on. And in programming, it feels that way, but oftentimes, at best you have to chip away. So I call that tempered optimism. Like you can have hopes that one day you will save the world, but just have a temper on it so that you can not beat yourself up if all you can do is chip away slightly at some
very true.
problem. And what I like about programming is one of the things I like about is it allows having both. you can say, well, I have these more modest goals and I have this possible, lottery ticket way out here making some really groundbreaking impact, or I could just make some modest goals and be happy with that. And I think programming is that way. Making computer games as a hobby is really nice for that because you can just because at worst you make a game and you could play around with it and it's something fun, it comes alive. But it's not necessarily the it's at best your algorithm or your idea could be used in real software and you know could make some impact, if you're really lucky.
Very true. I always say, in order for you to study a big issue, it's best to study it in a very small, controlled manner. And as you start to detect patterns, then you start to have a better sense of the issue and you go forward. So what I mean by this is if I'm trying to understand a particular topic and I want to conduct focus groups, instead of having 100 people within the room to all dish ideas, I would conduct 10 or 15 different focus groups where then I can take what I learned from this focus group, try to apply it to the next, try to apply it to the next. And from then on, I'll start to have a bigger understanding of what that particular issue is. So, yeah.
Yeah, it's hard to manage huge numbers of people. You really want an average of one or two people wanting to talk at any given time.
Yeah.
So it kind of makes sense. So maybe 5 or 10 is about what
Yeah.
gets one or two to be active any. That sounds about right.
Yeah. And then from there you go on. Or even if you're conducting surveys and you're interested in a particular population, let's say women, for example, you can start with women in New Jersey and see if their ways of life align, or actually, let's say we are interested in studying women and New Jersey. We can start with one particular town, and we can use that town and then go into that county. And then from that county, we can then go into one particular region, whether it is the south, north, east of New Jersey. And from then on, you get to understand all of the perspectives of New Jersey. But if you are doing research and trying to figure out how women feel about something, and even if you try to stratify your data, I don't think that would be helpful because you may most likely will miss out on certain opinions that would certainly shift how you would analyze that data or how you come to understand what is being told about that specific topic. That's a lot. It's just research. Are we still focusing on on the Bible, or are we going?
Yeah,
The Bible.
yeah,
But in order
I
to
wanted
understand
to.
God,
Yeah. This
in order
was
to understand God, you gotta compare, like you gotta understand the human too. Like what in the 48 laws of power, like you also have to I'm using the enemy watch and you win 1,000 battles. So if you understand yourself, you can relate to God. Like you can see something, you can see that. Listen, you just like a little compared to God, you're nothing. To us understanding all of these challenges and whatever that we face, or we can see the wonders and the mystery of God or Jesus. Yeah, the same.
Yeah, I wanted to talk a bit more about the mystery of God, and I think Brian and Isaac weren't here in the very beginning when I proposed my point of view on what God means to me, and a big theme surrounding these particular Bible study sessions is active inference. So, active inference considers how we utilize the dynamics of perception in terms of how we're engaging with stimulus in the world around us, like how we perceive the stimulus, and then how we respond to the stimulus, like taking action on the stimulus that we perceive, and developing a history of priors, that which is we're learning as we're engaging. We're developing a sense of intuition of, okay, if I interact with the environment in this way, I notice certain patterns. I'm going to lean towards these type of decisions, and how we optimize leveraging decisions as beings of agency or agents. So in cognitive science and more recently in machine learning community, there's this idea of agential systems or agents. And in biology, we can understand agents as single agent systems, or more broadly as multi-agent systems. So single agent systems, we can think of single cell organisms. Multi-agent systems, we can think of multicellular organisms. And the functions of these different classifications of agents that we can think of, not to limit agency to be pertaining to biology, but where we see agency manifest is largely right now in biology, since humanity has yet to build technologies that manifest agency. Well, right now we're focused on building systems that have properties of resembling how we can augment our own agency with how we can communicate better with each other and better interact with the world around us, in the sense of developing agentic systems and generative models like you see with large language models, but these things don't have agency, right? And biological organisms have degrees of agency. And I think what makes God interesting, and I'm approaching God from the teleological perspective, the perspective of, okay, we have the sense of agency being that awareness, and to the point that we have this sufficient degrees of being able to manifest a conscience of aligning a moral compass between other like-minded agents of sophistication, right? We have this capacity to augment and utilize language that other organisms that aren't human, they don't have them. So that's what makes humans unique. Not to say that humans are the only organisms that will ever exist within the history of the universe now and forevermore. I think we just happen to be, circumstances of how humans evolved enabled us to have the sufficient degrees of agency that we have this level of awareness due to how we evolved, due to language and all these properties of iterative generations of knowledge being passed down. So we get society, and then we have technologies like computers we use to communicate with each other and all that good stuff. And making humans interesting here, the fact that we have this capability to develop civilization, and then the way we communicate with each other that no other organism can, which is so interesting, and yet it can be, the way we choose to engage with each other collectively, matters at scale, like how we impact our ecosystem at scale, and how we, and how we engage with each other. I think this is really interesting from the teleological perspective. And from that angle, I look at God as not an entity per se, but really as a hyperstructure, or a hyper real structure, right? And what I mean by a hyperstructure is we can think of different attributes that we might add on to what does it mean to, for us to optimize each other's agency? What does it mean to have, if when we're thinking back at biblical scripture, right, and relating that to how we as humans not are not overly prideful, and that like we focus on the sense of compassion and love towards each other and caring for our ecosystem, right? Like there's these different aspects that we denote to the sacred, or what manifests as aspects of God, right? Because it's like, just to say who God, try to identify who God is like trying to talk about who is mathematics, right? Or like who is the universe, and it's not that I'm saying that God is the universe. I don't think that God is all that is and all possibilities. I think
Yeah.
God is the manifestation of good that manifests from agency of those that, in particular, that the agency of those that have the qualities humanity has, where we have the sense of awareness, that we collectively can act on this sense of awareness to guide the direction of humanity and its relation to humanity's relation to the ecosystem, and in relation to all else that exists, and in relation to ourselves as humanity, right? So it's both personal and interpersonal, but there's no general structure of this. Like there's like just like there's like possibilities that we cannot, there's all kinds of optimized outcomes in which we can interact with each other, and what that how that unravels, for better or worse, right? And to me, I think it's just kind of ridiculous to assume that God is something that we could stereotype as some general form or some entity or having a gender. I think, to me, that's ridiculous. And and I think it's quite ironic I came to this realization, because, as I mentioned earlier in the session, I was an atheist for a very long time, and then I came up with this very interesting uh, way to identify what God means from a personal and interpersonal level, that to me is deep philosophically, and not just so philosophically, but anthropomorphically, right? In the sense of, like, it's not just about me, but it's about how I relate to everyone else, and to the environment, and in a way that appreciates and respects agency, in a way that acknowledges humbleness and humility, in how I relate to the world around me. So to me, that's what the sacred is, and I feel like the sacred really manifests as aspects of God, and for me, and in that sense, I think it's silly for me to say, oh, this is what God is. It's like, okay, God has certain properties because God is relational, so it's like Isaac was saying earlier, it's like, oh, proving that God exists is like, I don't know if we could do that. I think it's ridiculous to say, or even make the claim to prove that God exists. It's like, okay, well, God is certain aspects of how we relate to reality in a collective sense, as these agents with sufficient degrees of sophistication, right? So that's how I feel what God, in a relational sense, in certain aspects, how we as humans identify with each other and reality around us. Like that's how, if somebody on the street, or somebody just, was just put me on the spot, it's like, hey, what does God mean to you? Because I think that's a really challenging question for people who aren't even Christians, or people who are wrestling with their faith. It's like, and I'm thinking, at the end of the day, it's silly for me to wrestle with my faith if I'm convinced that God is these different aspects, of which there's no limit to how many aspects we can pin down, that allow us as humans to develop these meaningful relations that empower ourselves and each other, and being mindful and all that good stuff. So hopefully that makes sense, but I could get a bit deeper into that, and even approach it from, okay, well, we could talk about even how a number of notable biologists, evolutionary biologists like Dennis Noble, argue about, okay, there is purpose. Biology does have a purpose-driven aspect to it in terms of how we evolved to survive as a species, right? Like this purpose-drivenness and epigenetics, right? This all comes together in a way that we could talk about how this relates to God, right? But anyway, I don't know how long I went on a tangent there, but I figured I'd throw that out there because I know, Isaac, you're talking about how God is part of the mystery of the universe and that there's this mystery of what God is. And it's like, well, it's like trying to generalize what God is kind of ridiculous, but we can point out all these different aspects that point to what God resembles, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
So, quick question. In
Sure.
your idea of God, it's not a being, it's us.
It's not, it's how we relate to the world around us and each other and all possible forms, or rather possibilities that manifest a reality in which we appreciate each other's agency, and that how that guides our survival as a species and other species of agents that exist, right? Like how can we optimize this capacity for agents to coexist and co-evolve with each other and appreciate the world around us. I think what's really also quite baffling about being an agent is that we are these complex assemblies of molecular structures that somehow develop this capacity to store memories and become aware. So we are the capacity of the universe to store a memory of itself in some way and become more aware of itself, right? And now where God fits into that picture is this capacity of memory storage and the self-awareness that manifests in a way that becomes this collective association of how different agents with this capacity relate to each other and have this explorative capacity of engaging with our surroundings, yet being mindful of our surroundings. So I consider this, like, I call it a post-theistic perspective. I call myself in that sense a post-theist because I'm past the point of being convinced that God exists or God doesn't exist. I think it's silly to even have that argument. It's like, okay, well, given that we assume that God exists, God is beyond thinking about just humans in the overly prideful and selfish sense, but like thinking about, okay, how can we as these beings with sufficient degrees of awareness appreciate each other and all that which exists and how in all possible ways that can manifest. And I think it's just not possible to imagine all possibilities of that, right? So in that sense, we can think of God being omniscient. That's a tongue twister, right?
Trust me, I understand.
Yeah.
So the Bible, in your perspective, is I guess a group of stories rather than facts.
It's not. I don't call it just a group of stories. I think there's a meta. I think the Bible is like a meta-anthology, right? It's a meta in a sense that it actually there's actually a lot of interesting ways we can relate human behavior to so many different aspects of scripture that That's what makes to me, that's what makes it compelling, is that how relatable the narrative is and all the different archetypes we can draw from it. So even if we assume, like for me, yeah, fine, I'm okay with assuming that that it's factor, that it's literal. But for me, that's not the part that I'm convinced of, right? Like that's not the part that really grabs me. What really grabs me is all the different ways you can make interpretations of the archetypes and relating that back to how I'm struggling with my own life, the challenges that I'm facing, and how I relate to the world around me. Like there's just so many ways to interpret scripture on its own. That on its own is all I need, right? That on its own is convincing enough, right? Because like the meta is like there's just so much there, and like the human experience, like how we're constantly trying to redeem ourselves, like all that is biblical, um and it's deep and so much to reflect on, like despite how much we go through and where we are in life. There is just this deepness to that, and to me, like that's a whole ocean we can just keep exploring. Like, not to say that, I'm not saying who cares if it's not an actual, like none of who cares if the narrative actually happened the way it's literally portrayed in scripture. I think there's value in talking about that, and I'm not dismissing that, but like for me, you know, I'm already bought by the archetypes, and the metas that we can, and the different ways we can string scripture, right? Not like going in a linear ordering of the books, but like, like going from one passage and jumping to another passage, right? So does that make sense?
I'm hearing you.
Yeah. Um,
So can I say something?
sure.
Sounds like what you're getting at is that the Bible is first and foremost, it's a hermeneutic book. It is intended to resonate with us and to be applicable to us first and foremost. It is not a scientific document. It is also, I believe personally, a living document, and that we are still a part of that story,
Mm-hmm.
and that a personal revelation continues to happen to this day, which is personally why I'm a part of the Mormon Church, because they are the only Christians that believe that personal revelation still happens, or at least believe it in the open.
Mm.
But it makes sense. I think there's something more than just archetypes.
Mm-hmm.
There is there's a lot of metaphors, like when Jesus fasted for 40 days and 40 nights. That phrase is used a couple times in the Bible, and it's
Mm-hmm.
just a huge amount of days. But uh, there is truth. Like, I see what you're saying, and I completely agree with it about the how it relates to us and how we interpersonally relate to. It resonates with me, and it resonates with me what Isaac was saying earlier too, about how we should identify and try not to identify so much with Jesus, but the apostles, because I think I've been trying to be like Jesus a little bit too much. Whereas maybe if I looked at these apostles more closely, I would have been more okay with being a flawed person.
I
Yes.
wanted to say one
Yes,
thing.
exactly.
Scientific truth is different than metaphysical truth.
Hmm.
When I say
The
that, I'm saying
philosopher.
well, evolution is a good example. There's overwhelming evidence, but it's evidence for the scientific truth. The metaphysical truth is, did it actually happen? If you were to go back in time, would you see it? Scientifically, that's actually not addressable. Science actually doesn't say, because science says it's impossible to go back in time, meaningless question. So with science, or as far as we know, it's impossible. And there's good reason to think why it is an impossibility. Science is saying a different question. They're saying, does what we observe today support the story of organisms transitioning over time? It doesn't say whether they actually did or not. And the answer is the evidence there is overwhelming. But then again, that's a scientific truth. That's not a metaphysical truth. That's not saying what actually happened or so on. Science isn't really about that, if that makes sense.
Yes, that does make sense. Thank you for the distinction. Although, when I think of science, I think of it more in the view of Descartes. It's a very Cartesian and strict thing in my mind. It's not like a Popperian thing. It is like, as much as I would like to try to believe that science is this body of evidence, in my mind, the way I've always thought that's just intrinsic to me is science is just brute, cold, hard facts, like the closest we can get to that. That's what it means to me.
Do you think that science actually achieves facts?
I think that the idea that Popper had about verisimilitude and what we were talking about here about chipping away is an eternal process. I think that we get closer and closer to the truth, but our approximations are never perfect reconstructions.
Yeah, that's exactly what I was gonna say. Only because I think there's a time when I'd conduct a study or so on, and I would say, "Oh, this is without a doubt what the data shows, right?" Or
Yeah,
truth.
sorry.
No, of course.
I think that's the way we all start out as kids. We kind of think, and when we're kids, we're like, the world is this exact way, and it's just a brute, cold, hard fact. And we ask our parents questions and sort of, okay, that's the way things are, kind of accept their answer. And then um, the Mormons have this idea of a shelf where it's like every time you get evidence that isn't perfectly in line with your current repertoire of belief and knowledge, you sort of store it on a little shelf, and eventually you have like a whole library that you've
Mhm.
amassed.
Yeah, very true. And it's the same point I was gonna make a little bit, where you get to a point when you're now the one conducting your own studies and you're now reviewing your own data, you're now more aware of the limitations of your data. And
Right.
you know that I didn't add this variable and I asked this question wrong. And so the answer that I received, yeah, it shows this for now, but if somebody were to ask it a different way, probably we would have a different answer. Or if you're running regressions and you take away one particular variable, and you'll
Yeah.
see the model completely shifts.
Yeah.
And there are a lot of questions that we possibly did not ask. And so it's always, I used to believe in concrete truths. That's no longer my take. It's just the data based on this particular time frame, the data based on these analyses that I conducted, based on these variables that were controlled for or included, and the knowledge and somewhat wisdom to understand that there may have been a lot of different variables
Hmm.
that play into this that I did not add within that particular issue, question, or whatever it may be. And so facts are, you know, they're not something I strive for anymore, but there are things that we do accept, and based on our own acceptance, we live with them.
Yeah, and then there's things that are like the distance from our current experienced reality, the distance of these facts from that reality that we're experiencing is so small that it would basically be, it wouldn't make any sense to deny it. Like to deny that we're having this conversation right here, it just wouldn't make any sense. But later on, you know, who knows? Maybe there's an extra dimension and we're clipping through time and meeting each other at different angles, and this isn't actually happening. Sorry, I'd just like to say one last thing. I've been doing a lot of data analysis recently, and I'm not a good programmer, but I just use AI because I'm trying to learn that way because I can see and it explains all the errors. And but if you have like 8 dimensions of data and you create a 2D visualization, you could do this at so many angles. You could do this at so many different cross sections, and it's like, which visualization is the truth? Like which one's the real? Which one represents the facts the best? Doesn't make it's kind of aesthetic.
Nice. One thing I've noticed, you can have the same question and you can run 2 different models, and the data will come out very different. So I mean, now anyways, when I write about certain things, I don't make it seem as if it's concrete knowledge. And that's one of the reasons why, especially as you go through the literature or any literature, you see that some people agree with certain things and some people agree or disagree. And it's based on how they structured their data. It's based on how they analyze their data, the methods that they use, and you come to different conclusions.
Yeah. It's all like relative. Not, I don't like to just say that like flatly, but not this kind of relative, but like this kind of relative, if that makes
Yeah.
sense.
I want to add that Casney made the point about how he feels that truth is not this concrete thing, and you know, even when we're looking towards paradigms of modern science and like you know, what historical understandings of mathematics and physics and just going down those rabbit holes as it's led us to is like to leading us to understanding that our understanding of reality itself is not even concrete. It's relative. And if we think of what really is the pursuit of science, a number of people are saying, well, it's all about data compression and prediction. And well, prediction we could say is about, okay, how can we estimate what's going to happen in the future given what's already happened and the history of things that happened based on different things that have unraveled that can give us clues on how they could unravel and different ways we could look at that, investigate that, have you. And compression is all about how we can take patterns of phenomena and pick them apart and come up with descriptors that come that are reductions that explain how how do we make sense about how different aspects of reality come together, like how do we better understand physics, how do we better understand how to build technologies by leveraging different algorithms and all of that. That's all comes out, it all comes down to compression.
Please.
But you know, in terms of, I think what's interesting about relationality, I saw this 3-day lecture series that Lisa Feldman Barrett gave, and the last lecture, I think I sent this to you
Yeah.
a bit ago, Ryan, and I think relational realism is interesting because it's approaching our understanding and our limitation of understanding reality to be relative to our interactions and our abstractions of reality itself.
To your point earlier in terms of science, when people define science, or as we have defined science, I think I don't think science as much as focuses a lot on what's the fact. I think science tries to figure out what's untrue, and it lets us know that this is the dead end, not to pursue that route anymore because we have enough evidence to say that's not it. But I don't think in terms of saying this is the true answer, that's never what probably was the reason for science. But I think as of now, we've come to realize that the best we can do is say, oh, we may have thought this was one of the reasons, this was one of the factors, this was something that influenced this, but we have enough evidence now to show that that's not the case. And so what else plays a role? And then we move on from there.
And I think what's really going to motivate a lot of positive driving force of scientific advancement is really like how do we optimize, how can billions of humans support each other at scale, like how can we come up with the right innovations to survive at scale and better, I guess I make it sound like I'm a broken record saying like, how much we should focus on appreciating each other and the world around us, and how we conduct ourselves in that fashion. But I think one really interesting passage that gets to this understanding of acting in good conscience, 2 Timothy 3 verses 1 through 5. I'm going off the NIV version. But mark this, there will be terrible times in the last days. People will be lovers of themselves, lovers of money, boastful, proud, abusive, disobedient to their parents, ungrateful, unholy, without love, unforgiving, slanderous, without self-control, brutal, not lovers of the good, treacherous, rash, conceited, lovers of pleasure rather than lovers of God, having a form of godliness but denying its power, having nothing to do with such people. So I think there's some deepness here about like what does it mean to what does it mean to be mindful and act in a way that gets us closer to God, right? And also appreciating the world around us.
I think that's a very interesting verse, because one of the first thing that comes to mind is, are we there yet, or is that something that's been the case? For example, I'm an African American male. I am living a better life now in 2024 than I would have in the US in 1960, 1940s, right? And so the first point when it talks about, hard times, I certainly do believe that my ancestors had a harder time in the US than I presently do. Or if we think about technology as it has evolved, I can say that I can pick up my phone currently. I can call whoever it is that I'm interested in speaking to, whether it is, parents and so on, or brother and so on. I can call for food and have it delivered to me. There is so much that I'm able to do presently that I once wouldn't have been able to do. And even though I know people say that this new generation, they're um, less altruistic, or they're not evil in the sense, but they care for themselves and no one else. But I do believe, with all of that, we always had individuals or kids who were stubborn. We always had kids who were disobedient. We always had murderers and so on. And so,
Yeah.
what is it that we get to this point where we realize, okay, this really itself is the very end? And not to say that I don't believe that we're reaching this point, because there are things that used to be considered whether illegal or frowned upon that now take place within our eyes and it's acceptable. However, still, there is another aspect of life where we found so much joy or so much advancement, and you start to wonder, even if the balance, even if the scale is no longer balanced, where exactly do we fit in terms of the space as opposed to where we are currently?
Mm-hmm.
So, for example, I asked this question before. Do you think we have 30 years before God returns? Or do you think it's 5, 10, 2?
What does it mean when God returns to you? Too, like that's what I'm also interested. Like, what does that mean?
Well, to
Like,
me, I've always thought
is that the moment of judgment to
two.
you,
I've
or
always thought of it in 2 ways. God returns for me in 2 ways. One, if I were to get outside right now and I die, God returned. Because there's nothing else I can do to fix whatever my life, to make sure that it's in alignment with his word, right? That my time has passed. And also judgment day, whereby God returns and now he's here and we get to know whether we are going to make it to heaven or whether we are going to burn in hell.
In my mind, on Judgment Day, we all climb up a giant staircase to a bunch of clouds, and basically we wait at a gate, and God explains whether or not we're getting in, and He reviews our whole entire life. He has like just a filing cabinet full of our whole life.
and if you
So
can't get in, you're just kind of stuck there at the gate, and all you can do is walk all the way down the steps and back up the steps. Like that. That's the rest. That's the rest of
I
eternity,
haven't thought
right?
about that. I've always just imagined that like I'm coasting on that 1% chance that I get in, but I think like in the movies that I watched, if you don't get in, then you just fall way down to hell. But I don't believe
That's
in hell
just too
though.
predictable, though, isn't it? It's like,
Yeah.
it's like what you least expect, right? You expect to just be stuck there, like, oh man, all I could do is walk up and down the steps and like bang on the gate. That's it.
Yeah. I imagine that like whatever the closest thing to hell is, it's basically just a bunch of puns. Like there's everything has like punny significance to you, but no one else understands the reference because it's something deep and meaningful to you that happened in your life or a specific thought you had at one time, and you just keep
Mhm.
relating it to different things, and you get tortured by this punniness eternally, or however long eternity is. It could be a second, it could be an hour or a year.
Yeah, but it feels like it lasts eternity. Yeah.
Because then, you know, bro, the DMT stuff with the brain about how that slows down our effects of time and all that stuff about how it gets released in the brain right as you're dying, like time could theoretically slow down infinitely on your deathbed,
Yeah,
and you
not
could
to
live a long
cut you
time.
short there, but there's a couple minutes left of the session, and I have it set till 9. It's 8:57 right now, but I first of all I want to thank everybody for participating, and the next session is gonna be October 10th. October
Okay.
10th. So it's gonna still be Thursday, 6 p.m. Um, so thanks so much for joining, and
Thanks for having us.
yeah,
Yes.
I
absolutely.
enjoyed meeting you, Kasni, and I believe I've met Kevin and Isaac. It was nice
Yeah.
meeting you all.
You, Ryan.
Yeah, I hope I.
Isaac, I know Isaac and I know Jesse. It's a pleasure.
Yeah, it's been a while since we all had a conversation. Yeah. The irony would be a Bible study. The ultimate irony. What brings us together is the Bible. But
It's
there you
it's
go.
kind of the opposite of ironic. It's like very sincere,
Yep.
Yeah,
but
there
it
you
is
go.
ironic. It's the double. Okay, I'll go now.
Double entendre.
At the risk of
Yeah.
yeah, at the risk of
Yes.
dwelling on, I'm gonna click leave.
Thank you so much. All right. Thank you everybody for participating.
Of course.
All
I
right.
appreciate it. Take it easy.